Hi everyone, happy Thursday. Thank you all for joining us today to go over how to master your edit without wasting time or money, featuring Natasa Lekic and our very own Robin Cutler. Before I hand you over to these very well-educated and expert ladies, we have a couple housekeeping tips. I want you to know that this is live tweeted, and you have a little function area in your preview box that should allow you just to tweet right from the webinar, so you don't even have to log into Twitter or anything like that. You can just live tweet along with us. We love the engagement. Also, if you have any questions during the presentation, we will take them. There's a Q&A box that you should find either at the bottom of your screen or on the left-hand side. You can ask any questions during the webinar, but we will hold about 10 minutes at the end to answer any that have come in from the experts talking. Also, printable version should be located somewhere near the bottom left-hand corner on your screen. So if you wanted to print that out or after take notes, share it with anyone, you can do that. And we record the webinar, so don't be afraid that you miss anything. You'll receive the recording about 76 hours after, and that'll be in an email. And then it also go up on YouTube, our YouTube channel. There's an IngramSpark YouTube channel. If there are questions that we don't happen to get to in that 10-minute time, we'll put the answers of those questions in the comment section. I also think that Natasa has another way to get your questions in that we'll talk about later on the webinar as well. And that's it for now. I want to wish you all the best for the happy holidays this month, and then I'm going to turn you over to Robin Cutler. Robin is the director of IngramSpark. She has led the way at Ingram and has been the pioneer for this self-publishing platform. And what you have as a product today, she's responsible for all of that. She has many years of publishing expertise and has really kind of built a self-publishing community throughout IngramSpark. So I'm going to turn it over to Robin.
And thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I know with the holiday season it's hard to kind of devote time for things like this, and I really appreciate your doing that. It's so important. And I'm really excited today to introduce you to Natasa Lekic, who, and that's a beautiful name, Natasa. I love this. I believe, as Natasa and I were just talking about, the importance of the editing as part of a process and bringing a book to market. I personally believe, and I talk about this a lot to authors, is if you have to pick one thing to invest in terms of, creating a book, I believe the most important thing is to, find a great editor, work with an editor, and it definitely will help improve your book. So I'm really excited to have Natasa today from New York Book Editors to really talk to us about the editorial process. Natasa has experience. She was working for the publisher herself at one point in her career, the managing editor at Atlas & Company, which is a literary nonfiction publishing house. And then she started New York Book Editors and will tell us all that we need to know about the editorial process. Welcome, Natasa.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So let's jump right in and make sure you're in the right place. I'm here to help authors who want to learn about the different types of editing so that you can make informed decisions to address your needs, who want to find the right editor who can help them make meaningful changes to their work, authors who don't have publishing experience and probably don't understand how to turn your draft into a polished, edited book. And then authors who know there are weaknesses in their manuscript. Sometimes you know when something just isn't right, but you can't exactly pinpoint maybe what it is or how to fix it. And authors who have tried to work with an editor or a copy editor who wasn't right for you. We're going to introduce a system that will help you vastly increase your chances of finding the right person. So, just to go over the agenda, the first thing we're going to cover is what to expect from an editor. And I'll fill you in on why you actually don't need grammar and punctuation fixes from your editor specifically, and how that may actually hurt your chances of improving your manuscript. And you'll learn how to get an edit that will help you develop your narrative and help you grow as an author. The second thing we'll cover is editing options. So you'll get to understand the different components of each edit so you can have the right expectations before you invest in one and before you decide which one is right for you. And we'll go on to address, as I mentioned, the steps you can take to find the right editor for you and your manuscript. And finally, the best part is you'll uncover how to avoid the most costly mistake in editing so that you don't waste time or money repeating one of the most common errors we see from first-time authors.
I really love this last one.
Oh, good. Yes. Well, I'm really happy to talk about that because, you know, it pains me when we hear from people who have made that particular mistake.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's get started with the first one, what you should expect from an editor. And so how many of you get bothered by those signs at the grocery store? A common misconception is that an editor is a grammar Nazi who's going to add commas and remove typos from your work. You know, that an editor is like that friend who says, "Don't you mean to whom?" instead of to who. The truth is that that's not actually an editor's role. So typos and grammar editors are certainly embarrassing. Errors are certainly embarrassing in a finished book. But the editor's role actually takes place further upstream. And I think we have a little diagram that will illustrate this. There we go. So this is the order of editing roles. And this is exactly how it works in traditional publishing as well. The reason I bring up traditional publishing is because I feel like they've really, over the last hundreds of years, refined the entire editorial process, which is why we follow their system so closely. I think it's very hard to improve upon it. So the editor works with you first. And they can be compared to a mechanic who's going to help you fix your car. You know there's something wrong with it. It's not driving properly. Maybe you hear something in the engine. So you go to the mechanic. And then now that your car is in the shop, what happens before they give it back to you? They clean it every time. They make it presentable. And that's similar to what the copy editor does. The copy editor is actually responsible for grammatical errors and much more. We'll expand on the copy editor's role in today's webinar. And then the proofreader steps in once your book is completely designed, once it's typeset. And that's the last check to make sure no errors were introduced as the text was laid out. We'll also get into depth on that role later on. So let's really dive into the first part, the edits. Not all edits are the same. There are really two types of edits. Although to confuse matters further, they go by different names. So the first one may be called a manuscript critique. You may also see it as a manuscript review. Sometimes it's called a developmental edit. The name doesn't really matter. Here's what you need to know. If your book needs big picture, structural level changes, you'll get a critique. You'll get that first type of edit. And the more intensive edit is usually called a developmental or a comprehensive edit. The way to know for sure if that's what you're getting is to ask whether the edit includes a line edit. If it does, you're getting the second type. So this may be confusing right now, but we're about to really dig into both types. This is just the overview. Okay, so here's an example of what I mean by big picture feedback. One of our editors, Jane Franzen, once used a Christmas lights analogy with an author in this type of edit. And since it's season appropriate, I thought I would add it here to today's webinar. She said, a story is all about the Christmas lights, amazing, magical moments, i.e. great memorable scenes, strung together to make a whole strand, i.e. the book. The wiring between the lights is absolutely vital. It moves the story forward. But the lights are the most important part. The scenes are where the story lives. Don't get so caught up in moving the story forward. For example, catching the reader up with everything that happened over the course of a few months. The wiring between the lights should be in the background. Build the scenes. Create the Christmas lights to dazzle the reader. And as you string them all together, you will build a full, dramatic, unput-downable book. So this is the kind of advice you'd find in a critique. Except then the editor, in this case Jane, went on to explain to the author which scenes specifically he could eliminate to make the wiring invisible, and what kind of transition sentences could be used to move the reader on to that next beautiful light. And here's one more example of big picture feedback. This is from another editor, Ronit. And it was for an epic novel that had several protagonists, and therefore many different POVs, points of view. The critique went into how to select POV characters in depth, which perspectives could be stripped out entirely, and how to enhance the ones that the author should use. So here's a snippet from her feedback. For each scene, the viewpoint character should be the one with the most at stake. When the queen is grieving over her son's death, the narration should be cast firmly from her point of view, since she has the most at stake. She is struggling to come to terms with her guilt, and she has a secret to protect. Ronit goes on to address many of the author's scenes to let him know exactly which character's perspective should be used in each. But, from this you can gather that in most cases, the author should use the character that the reader is really dying to hear more about, whose perspective is really the key in that scene. So here, let's take a look at the type of issues an editor may address through a critique. And it places emphasis on what we call the 3 Ps, POV, point of view, plot structure, and pacing. How to improve narrative voice is also a big one, as is obviously pinpointing opportunities to develop characters. Another type of issue I'd like to pull out is summary versus action. So when to describe exactly what's happening in a scene and when to summarize it, which is very similar to, or the same as what we saw in Jane's advice. So as you can see in this list, all of these things refer to structural, big picture type changes, which is what you find in a critique, that first type of edit. So more specifically, to talk about form, the critique will always have an editorial memo or letter. Once again, this also goes by different names, but it's exactly that. It's a very long letter to you, the author. Usually at least 7 pages, but it depends on the length of your manuscript and on the editor's feedback. And it addresses weaknesses in your manuscript. But here's the important part. the memo should give you specific suggestions on how to solve those weaknesses. So the editor shouldn't be saying, you know, well, there's something that isn't quite working with this character in this part of the book, you know, and just point out the weakness and expect you to figure out how to solve it. They're actually, a good editor will explain the weakness and give you a suggestion for how to overcome it. And that's part of the edit that's so challenging. It actually takes them a long time to think about what the most efficient, first of all, because you don't want to, you know, make more changes than you have to, an effective way to solve whatever issue arises. And I had actually an example of that long letter. There we go. Another regularly used component of a critique is margin comments. So these are comments that the editor adds directly to your pages. This is a rather complex example, probably not the best one, but for a nonfiction book, and it comments on the thesis of the work. So as you can see in this example, the editor highlighted a sentence that he felt was the main thesis for the book. So he was saying that the author should make it a focal point of his chapter. And I'm sure he addressed it in the memo as well. But margin comments are usually used to show specifically on the page which scenes or sections should be reworked and why. But as you can see, it's, even though he's highlighting that specific sentence, he's commenting on it in a big picture fashion. It's not, you know, he's not rewording that sentence. So with that said, let's get into that second type of edit. This is the comprehensive or developmental one. And this edit includes everything we just discussed with that one extra twist, which is a line edit. And let's see a line edit example actually before we cover why you wouldn't get this great additional component in a critique, why they're separated this way. So here's what a line edit looks like generally. The editor meticulously scours the manuscript for any weaknesses line by line, to where the name comes from. It's basically what your old English professor did to your essays. You know, redlined your carefully crafted sentences in such a way that at first you were probably upset, or at least I was, to see so many red marks. But then you saw how much sense the changes made and probably how much the prose flowed better or the meaning of what you were saying was clarified. And this is more specifically lists the goals of a line edit. Usually, the editor is actually changing your sentences using deletions, shifts in words, phrases, sentences to improve the flow of your prose and its overall effect. And it's done using track changes in Word, as you saw in the previous slide. So you can clearly see what the editor's changes are, and you can actually easily accept, reject, or modify them. So line edits should really polish the manuscript. It's once you have the structure of your work in place. And you're probably thinking, what is this slide about? So now that we've covered the two types of edits, let's figure out why you would get one over the other. Imagine you're at the dentist, and she says, your wisdom tooth may have to come out soon. That's a horrible thing to hear, but then she says, hey, do you want to invest in a filling and extra cleaning for the wisdom tooth that may be extracted soon? Or would you rather wait until we know whether we're going to pull it out? Getting a comprehensive edit is the same thing. If you're going to remove scenes, change points of view, restructure a good portion of your manuscript, it doesn't make sense to get a line edit. The editor would be making those English professor type of line suggestions on scenes that won't end up being used in the book. It'll just end up being a huge waste of time. So if you remember those point of view changes that, so that wouldn't change that much of the book, but the initial example of big picture changes with the Christmas lights, all of the scenes that, not all, but the scenes that presented the wiring in the book would have been removed, right? Would have been cut out after that edit. Had the editor done a line edit, it would have included all those scenes, which just wouldn't make sense. We're going to get into the copy editor stage. So copy editors are your line of defense against the type of reviews that are really heartbreaking because they say, you know, it's a good story, but it got buried under the grammar and spelling mistakes. And it's not easy to become a copy editor. They're not glorified spell checkers. Grammar can get very complicated. In fact, copy editors, although this is what they do all the time, they often have to consult the Chicago Manual of Style, which is generally the industry standard. And I would recommend that authors get a copy of that, actually, that tome. And they also consult, another industry standard is Merriam-Webster's dictionary. So in addition to correcting spelling, grammar, punctuation, and syntax, a copy edit also ensures consistency in hyphenation, numerals, fonts, capitalization, and a copy editor checks your facts as well. So as an example, if your characters went to the beach in Wyoming, say, wait, does Wyoming have a beach? And this is more important, as you can imagine, probably for nonfiction, because there are usually a lot of facts in nonfiction that need to be checked and verified. So consistency plays a big role in this, but let's figure out what that means exactly. So this is a small example. Is email spelled with a hyphen on page 26 and without a hyphen on page 143? Words like that need to be consistent. Or do you use British or American spelling variations, such as favorite with a U and then favorite without the U? And here's one more example of consistency. Is the protagonist's house yellow in the first chapter and suddenly blue in the third chapter? When you see these examples right now, it seems so obvious, but you know how many details your book contains. So easy to slip up on these things, and it can be jarring for the reader if they notice. So that's a copy editor's role. And just to give you a sense of what it looks like from a distance, from a bird's eye view, I know these pages are very tiny on your screen, but here's a series of pages from a copy edit. And those lines in the margins, if you see the purple lines going, are all the changes that were made. And something to keep in mind is that not every single grammatical mistake or typo will be picked up. So in traditional publishing, there may be 2 passes of a copy edit, sometimes even 3. It really depends on how clean the manuscript is. And if your copy edit comes back heavily changed, so if there are a lot of changes, it's more likely that some things were missed. So you just want to be aware of that. And back to that diagram, let's briefly review that last step, the proofreading step. So as I mentioned earlier, proofreading takes place after your manuscript is typeset, which really means once your words are laid out to look like a book. And proofreading is almost like an extra copy editing pass because they may do light editing, such as correct inconsistent spelling, look out for grammar. A big part of what they do is actually look out for hyphenations. So once your words are laid out in the interior design, some words may be chopped up at the end of those lines, and the proofreader pays very close attention to that because you don't want too many hyphenated words at the ends of your lines. But it's important to know that the proofreader is not actually copy editing, so it's not an actual copy editing pass, because if too many errors are cited, they may return the proof for further copy editing. And what I always say, although some people may disagree with me, is self-publishing authors who have had their manuscript professionally copy edited can try to skip the proofread. If you're on a budget, you may try to proofread your own work. There won't be as many errors to contend with at that stage. So, out of the three of those, I would say that this is the stage that you're probably more well-equipped to handle than the other two. Do you agree with that, Robin?
Yeah, and one of the tricks that you can try if you're wanting to copy edit your own work is to actually read your manuscript aloud and go through it, the whole thing, and you will find things when you read it that don't necessarily sound like, especially dialogue, like it doesn't sound exactly right when you read it aloud. So that's a good way to try to copy edit yourself and do it that way. Take some time, but I think it's really, really important.
That's great advice. Yeah, it's great advice. It's very different from reading in your head. You'll pick up on a lot of things.
Yes, exactly, and especially your dialogue. You should always read your dialogue aloud.
Yeah, that is a very tricky part of writing dialogue. I actually always say it's good to, authors obviously you don't write dialogue that you change it from, you can't overhear conversations and use conversations. Most conversations have a lot of, mundane fillers in them, but it is important to really pay attention to conversations in everyday life and just sort of hear the variations. And, let's say a lot of people have trouble writing dialogue for children, as an example. Children always seem to sound so precocious in books. So that's one instance where it's really good to just take the time to really listen to how children speak and maybe take your cues from that. So the second topic, how to find the right editor for you and your manuscript. And this may be controversial because I say this publicly all the time, but then I get a lot of emails from freelance editors who get upset at me. So I just wanted to preface it with that. At New York Book Editors, we've considered at least 400 editors over the past 4 years who have wanted to join our team. And we learned a lot from that. The biggest thing we learned that can help you with your search is that the best editors have publishing experience. Here's a typical email we receive from freelance editors. First part says, "So please don't discount me for not having worked in-house at a New York publisher." And it's hard to say no because this editor may very well be a genius. The editor may very well be better than most of the editors on our team. But having having considered so many editors over the past few years, our data shows that the chances of this are so slim that we can't spend the time and resources to consider people who have never worked for a publisher. So just to give you, what we do in-house, how we think of these things. Editors with many years of experience show a deeper level of insight that really transforms a manuscript. I've seen this time and time again. So I wouldn't underestimate the value of working with someone who has spent years at a publisher, working with senior level editors, working with peers, being trained on editing. It makes all the difference. So my best advice is to look for that experience, and more specifically, to look for 4 years of in-house experience. And the reason I say this is because 4 years is a sweet spot. The editor has worked on enough books to have become an associate editor usually. Every imprint works differently in terms of promotions, but usually. And at that point, they're acquiring their own titles, which means they have a great level of responsibility, and they've achieved that because they've proven themselves. I know I'm going to get emails, angry emails about this, but this is my opinion. This is our experience at New York Book Editors. So this is what I continue to believe. And this is my best advice to people. And the second best piece of advice is to make sure you get a sample edit or a trial edit before you commit to an editor for your full book. So a typical trial will include a 10-page read-through, 5-page line edit, a brief email with the editor's thoughts, and something like a 20-minute consultation call. And this is enough to give you a sense of how the editor works. Think of it as a snapshot of the editor's skills. You'll want to ask yourself if you agree with their initial feedback. Does it sound like what you were looking for? And an important component of this is the phone call. Some authors want to skip that part, but it's very important to see if you have a good rapport with the editor. And a call is the best way to do so. It's also a great opportunity to ask the editor questions, and similarly for the editor to ask you questions. So one thing I'll say though is don't assume that what the editor does, usually what the editor does to your first few pages ends up being, in your final book. But it's not necessarily the case, because at this point you need to remember that they haven't read your entire manuscript. And once they have a comprehensive idea of your narrative, of your story, they might come back to you and say, I really believe you didn't start the book in the right place. Would you consider changing chapter 1 to this? Here's why. And so the editor's feedback will definitely change once they properly understand your entire story. That's just something to keep in mind. This is really a glance at their impressions and their changes. So this is also a big one. You should ask them what type of edit they recommend. And now you know about the types because we went over them. And make sure they don't conflate copy editing and editing. That's really important to keep that in mind. See if they suspect you may have more work to do before you get a line edit. Find out if they think you're ready for a line edit, and if they do, that's great. That means that your book seems structurally sound. You've come a long way. But at this stage, once again, remember they haven't read your entire manuscript, so they can't be sure. They can't be 100% sure what type of edit you need. But most experienced editors, once again, can tell from skimming your full manuscript what kind of edit would benefit you most. So it's not a science, but having had a lot of experience, you know, they usually can tell. They usually see fairly quickly. And one other thing I want to say is don't work with an editor who's willing to go with whatever you say, or someone who doesn't review your manuscript before they recommend a type of edit. Those are definite red flags. You need to look to the editor. You may have, obviously you'll have in mind the type of edit that you want or that you believe you're ready for. But really expect the editor to make their recommendation because, you know, they've worked on so many books. They should have a clear idea of where you stand and what would benefit you most.
Yeah, and I would say don't work with an editor that's related to you. If you want to.
Oh, I never thought of that one. That might be a good one. You want to keep those relations.
Yeah, it's just really, unless they're a professional, which probably that's not likely, but you know, your family members, your best friends are going to be kinder, and I shouldn't even say the word kind, but are probably going to be less critical in terms of the writing itself than a professional editor would be. And that's not going to serve you well in the end.
That brings a great point up as well, which is, you know, the editor will point out your strengths, which is important, because it's important for you as an author to know your strengths so that you can build on them, you can enhance those. But really, the bulk of their feedback will be critical. And, you know, those are the things that will really help you progress and hone your craft. So, you know, if you find that most of what's said in, let's say, a sample or trial edit is flattery, it may be tempting to work with that person, but they're probably not going to really push you as an author. Okay. So the final topic on today's agenda, that big one, how to avoid the most costly mistake in editing. Now that you've watched most of this webinar, you're not likely to make this mistake, but we need to do a deep dive into it because it's so common, unfortunately. We hear a lot from authors like Chi Kian, and he had not one edit, not two edits, not even three edits, but he had 4 edits done on his manuscript before he came to us. And the problem was they weren't actually edits. He thought he had been getting edits, but they were copy edits. And that's why even 4 passes later, he didn't feel good about the state of his manuscript. When he started working with Dan, who's an editor from Norton, he discovered he had been heading in the wrong direction. He didn't need grammar fixes. He needed a line edit to help his prose. He needed to develop his thoughts slightly differently. So let's take a look at some of the changes, and this isn't Chi's work, Chi's was nonfiction, but that take place from the original draft to after the editor has done a line edit. So starting with the original passage here, my father was a hero. During a drugstore robbery, he saved a pregnant woman from being shot. Unfortunately, as my mother likes to say, usually after several vodkas, he saved the wrong effing pregnant woman. For as he was, well, this is the image I've always had, in a blue suit, running in slow motion like the Bionic Man down the store's aisle, then diving through the air, wincing as the thief shot at him, my mother was in labor with me. So I actually inserted a comma automatically when I read it, but it's not actually there. But maybe you noticed that it was the last sentence wasn't that clear. So you'll see in the second paragraph, the editor added, instead of for as he was, it says, for at the very moment he was, and this is how I've always imagined it. And it may not be clear from me reading it out to you, but certainly when you look at the printout, you'll see that the second version is clearer. You understand immediately that the narrator is saying that since she wasn't there, she's imagining what happened, that at that very moment at which her father was saving one pregnant woman, her mother was going into labor with her. And here's what the copy editor would do. And this isn't actually fair. I'm going to let you know, we removed the comma from the first example so that it would be clearer that usually that would be included in a copy edit. But an editor will actually, a lot of these stages overlap. An editor will actually make changes like that. They will make grammar fixes as well. It's just not, it's not usually their role. The copy editor is just looking for that, just looking for those objective types of changes. So here's what a copy editor would do. Remove the apostrophe from vodkas in this example, capitalize bionic man, inserted the comma after shot at him, and changed the spelling of labor. So what you're hopefully noticing is that the copy editor doesn't change the content of your work. They aren't reading to see if it flows well. They aren't reading to see if the setup is clear for the reader. They're really making these very objective changes. So here's a look at some proper definitions. A line edit will focus on the way you communicate your story. Is your language clear, fluid, and pleasurable to read? Does it convey a sense of atmosphere, emotion, and tone? Do the words you've chosen give a precise meaning, or are you using broad generalizations and cliches? A copy edit addresses flaws on a very technical level to make sure your writing is in accordance with industry standards of grammar, spelling, consistency, and factual accuracy. The line edit requires more time because the editor is assessing clarity, tone, and meaning, and working out how to improve on these. I know many editors who will stop their editing, go for a walk, really think about something that they've noticed in the book, think about several solutions, and then come back and share one on the page. So as you imagine, just to give you a sense of the kind of response that you'll have after an edit, most authors are thrilled to have someone respond to their work at that level, at the editing level. On the other hand, since the copy editor is there to ensure the rules of grammar and other objective standards are being followed, authors don't tend to write love stories after their copy edit. It's more of a, this looks great kind of response. So given, the level at which your editor is responding to your work, you just tend to develop a different relationship with the editor versus the copy editor. So now that you know that more work and time is involved in a line edit than a copy edit, or an edit in general than a copy edit, you can guess what the biggest and most costly mistake in editing is for first-time authors. It's the same mistake Cheeky Ann made. It's important not to get a copy edit when you're paying for a line edit. And here are the average rates from the EFA, the Editorial Freelancers Association, on editing. And if you want to see the exact website source, it's there below the table. Their website is a great source of information in general. And, in addition to the hourly fees, you want to pay attention to the estimated pace column. So since line editing usually takes longer and has a higher hourly fee. And remember, it also includes when I say line edit, no editor just does a line edit. They're also responding to your work on a more substantive level. The cost of line editing is often higher. So this bears repetition, because if you only take one piece of advice away from this webinar, it's don't confuse a line edit for a copy edit. It's a costly and time-consuming mistake that can easily be avoided. So just when you're getting that sample edit or that trial edit, make sure you're looking for, those deeper insights, those responses to your story, your narrative, rather than, the grammatical and punctuation changes. And I think we're about to go into the Q&As. As Kristen mentioned, if we don't get to every question, you can definitely email me. I'll get the email at that second address, info@mybookeditors.com. And here are some other ways you can get in touch with us. So I think we'll get to the questions now.
Thank you very much, Natasha. That was wonderful information, and I'm sure everyone got a lot out of those slides. We have a few questions. I'll start with one that we got from Julie. She says, what if you think that you're ready for a line edit, and that's the contract that you enter into, but the editor discovers that there's a major plot issue? Is the process flexible enough to allow these decisions to be made as the process unfolds?
So the process isn't perfect. That definitely happens. It's rare, but it happens. And in that case, it's really important to reassess your original contract. And I would always recommend changing the type of edit, because certainly if that's what the editor is recommending, because the editor probably saw something that, will lead to substantial changes, and it's not worth your while to then, get a line edit, have the whole manuscript line edited. So, yeah, it's important for her to point that out if she didn't see it originally when she reviewed the manuscript, and I mean, get a better sense of what the editor sees in your plot, have a conversation about it, but in all likelihood, you'll probably end up changing the type of edit.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question, Julie.
Moving on. Deborah asks, when you get a developmental line edit review of your manuscript, are you expected to take or make all of those changes?
The hope is that you implement all of those changes, but really it's up to you. If you see something that you just don't agree with, it's really your call. The editor is there to make suggestions. That's their role. And most of the suggestions, if it's a good editor, will make perfect sense to you. You'll say, yeah, I can't believe that, I didn't have that earlier, or I didn't see that. But if there are things that you disagree with, absolutely, then, don't make that change.
Hey, Natasha, I just want to add here,
Sure.
it's important for you as the author to be open to the suggestions that your editor's going to give to you. A lot of people go into this expecting, the editor to verify what they think is a fabulous manuscript. If your editor comes back with great suggestions on how you can improve it, you really need to be open to those suggestions and really and really, enact on those suggestions. It's to the benefit of your work, and I've seen it throughout the years in working, especially with academic authors, where they could be resistant to the editor, and it's better if you go into this really being open from the get-go.
That's a great point. I will share one little story if we have time. There was an author, and this usually happens when there's that critique type big picture change. There was an author who got feedback that included, and this was a book he had worked on for years, so it's the story arc was very solid in his mind. Who suggested that from the beginning of the book, he reframe the entire narrative. So instead of the book started with the protagonist telling his mother, who was ill in a hospital bed, the truth about his life, and the editor suggested that the protagonist actually be the one in the hospital bed telling his mother. And without getting into the specifics, since we don't have that much time, there were many elements of the narrative, weak spots that were actually resolved by this change in the framing device. And when he first got this feedback, it was difficult to take. So he thought about it for 2 days. And on the third day, he woke up and he thought, that's right. That's exactly right. That's the way it should be. And he was so excited about the change. So it's something that, sometimes, especially when, you get the type of changes that really change how you see your own story, it can be difficult advice. If you let it sit and just think about it for a little while, sometimes that changes your perspective.
Thank you, Natasha. We've got quite a few other ones. So let's see, I just had one pulled up. I think it might go hand in hand with the earlier question asked about changing the plot and things like that. So Marina's wondering kind of the same thing, like you're paying for a full line edit, and then towards the end of the manuscript, the editor realizes that the last several chapters need to be reduced into one. But meanwhile, you've paid per word for all of it. Have you just wasted your money?
So I wouldn't say that you've wasted your money, because the difference on a per word level for the line editing portion isn't that significant. I think the important thing is to, especially if it's just the last 3 chapters that are in question, and this is just my opinion, but if the change that the editor is suggesting makes sense to you, then and you can ask the editor to do a line edit once you change that last chapter, once you consolidate those chapters. A line, when you're at the line editing stage, and I probably didn't make this clear in the webinar, you will get structural changes as well. It's just a matter of how much. Like it won't, it shouldn't be at the level that where you're changing, and there's no percentage sort of your novel. It's not a hard and fast rule. There's no science to it. There really should be some revisions on that scale. There usually are, even at the line editing stage. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. The editor really is probably doing her job.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a couple little quick ones.
Sure.
So you had mentioned your sample edit earlier in the presentation. We're wondering, is that free or is it charged at standard rates?
So different people will do it differently. For New York book editors, it's $165, and it's refunded if the author doesn't think it was beneficial. And,
okay.
you know, it's just important to ask. Yeah, go ahead.
That's okay.
I know
no,
that
you
these
go ahead.
are quick fires. Sorry, I won't expand.
I also wanted to mention that if you are an IngramSpark member, you get 10% off with
That's
Natasha
right.
and New York Book Editors.
Yes.
Another quick one that we have, do you work with script editors? Do you have script editors?
We don't, but if you email me using that email, we can recommend someone outside of our team, but I'd be happy to send a recommendation.
All right. Thank you so much. We do have a few other ones, so what will happen, everyone, is we'll send those on over to Natasha, and she will answer them for us. And then if you visit our YouTube channel, the IngramSpark YouTube channel, you'll see the Q&A in the comments section under her specific video of this webinar. So, Natasha, I want to thank you again for your time. Robin, both of you, this was great. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Happy holidays.
Yes, thanks for having me. I hope it helps. Happy holidays. Bye.
Happy holidays.